It's that time of year again, so today we're going to be looking at something spooky. Well, spooky for anybody who lives near water. If you live near a cornfield, that's scary enough, I think. We're going to be talking about a real-life ghost ship called the SS Baychimo and the really interesting events surrounding it. The SS Baychimo was a 230-foot-long steel cargo ship built in Sweden in 1914 for a German company and originally sailed under the name Angermanhaven. It was later given over to the British after World War I as part of German war reparations. Then, in 1921, the ship was given to the Hudson Bay Company, where it was renamed the SS Baychimo. The Baychimo's main duty was to regularly cross the North Atlantic, delivering furs from the Arctic regions surrounding northern Canada and Alaska. All of this was going swimmingly until years later, in late September of 1931, the SS Baychimo was sailing through the frigid waters off the coast of northern Alaska near the town of Barrow when it was suddenly enveloped by a blizzard. This blizzard would end up trapping the Baychimo in what's known as pack ice, and pack ice is essentially what happens when fragments of floating sea ice freeze together, forming this giant free-floating sheet of ice. And back then, it wasn't all too uncommon for ships, even as big as the Baychimo, to get stuck in pack ice. Crews were often forced to spend large amounts of time on the ice as they waited for it to thaw whenever the temperature warmed up. And this is actually what ended up happening to the Baychimo and its crew. As the blizzard worsened, the crew decided they needed to drop anchor and wait out the storm. But by October 1st, they realized that the storm wasn't going to let up, so they decided to leave the ship and trek roughly half a mile to the nearby town of Barrow, Alaska. Now, you may be wondering why the crew of the Baychimo didn't just stay aboard their ship to weather the storm. Well, there are some things to consider. This is because they weren't really able to keep the ship sufficiently heated throughout the winter, or even just for long periods of time, along with the fact that the ship could sink at any time due to the compressing forces of the pack ice on the Baychimo's hull. The crew of the Baychimo stayed in Barrow for about 2 days until the blizzard finally let up, and when the crew returned to their ship, they found it had mostly broken free from the ice, but it was still where they had left it. But as the captain was inspecting the Baychimo's condition, he noticed that the storm and the ice had caused pretty extensive damage to the ship, and he decided it was just a little bit too unsafe to continue sailing along their route. So the crew decided to construct a temporary shelter nearby and keep watch over the Baychimo throughout the winter. And once again, roughly a week later on October 8th, the Baychimo would become stuck in thick pack ice. Over the course of the next few weeks, the crew would occasionally venture back and forth to the Baychimo to make sure that it was, still floating. And also they would clear excess ice from the ship's rudder just so that it wasn't damaged by the shifting of the pack ice. They did this until on November 24th, another intense blizzard blew through the area, forcing the crew to stay in their shelters. Also, over the course of this blizzard, it's reported that the temperatures rose dramatically from negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit all the way up to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, just over the course of a couple days, which would cause problems for the crew. After this blizzard cleared up, some of the crew prepared to go do their regular maintenance on the Baychimo, but when they looked out onto the water, they noticed it was gone. The crew thought, seeing as though their ship had just been constantly compressed by the pack ice, and it was already pretty badly damaged to begin with, they thought the ship had simply just taken too much damage and sank during the blizzard. But a few days later, a local seal hunter told the crew that he'd spotted the Baychimo trapped in pack ice about 45 miles southwest of where they were camped in Barrow, near an area known as Skull Cliffs. So with that knowledge, the crew left to track down their runaway ship. You see, what had actually happened to the Baychimo was it didn't actually sink, of course, but during the blizzard, when the temperatures rose dramatically, the pack ice that was trapping the ship actually melted and cleared just enough so that the ship could freely drift away about 45 miles. Anyway, when the crew finally tracked down the Baychimo, They boarded the ship only to find that since it looked like it had taken a pretty significant amount of damage from the pack ice and the storms, it seemed likely that the ship would eventually sink because of this. So the crew decided it was best to gather up all the most valuable cargo and abandon the ship, reporting it as a loss to the Hudson Bay Company. And that was that. Due to the extreme icy conditions of the Arctic, the ship was abandoned and it sank soon after. Actually, no, that's not what happened. You see, it turns out several months later, the Baychimo was spotted perfectly afloat almost 250 miles east from where the crew had first abandoned her. This would be the first of a dozen sightings of the SS Baychimo over the course of the next 38 years. The next few sightings of the Baychimo were simply reports of a moderately sized steamer cargo ship drifting silently with the currents along the shores of northern Alaska. I want to also mention that the people who saw the Baychimo drifting along the currents weren't really surprised to see a ship abandoned like this, since the sight of abandoned ships in the Arctic was actually a somewhat common occurrence, since ships would often get stuck in winter pack ice, and sometimes the crews would abandon these ships for various reasons. However, usually these ships would sink shortly after their abandonment due to the extreme hazards of the Arctic, so the Baychimo was absolutely an anomaly when it came to abandoned ships in the Arctic. Which for some, this brought up ideas that maybe some sort of paranormal force was guiding the ship, with some passerbys reporting seeing a phantom crew manning the ship as it drifted silently through the cold Arctic waters. Sounds kind of spooky. Anyway, I really wanted to get to one sighting in particular, which is my personal favorite, and it started in March of 1933 when a group of Alaskan natives were trekking along the Alaskan coast, when suddenly a blizzard began rolling through the area, and as the group was searching for shelter, they noticed a large ship was trapped out on the pack ice. This ship was the SS Baychimo. So with no other shelter in the area, they decided to make their way over to the ship, where they found that it was actually totally abandoned, and at this point it had been abandoned for a couple of years, so it was likely in pretty poor condition. But due to the intense blizzard outside, the natives were forced to stay inside the Baychimo for about 10 days. And eventually the blizzard finally dissipated and they were able to leave. It's stories like this that really make me curious. Like, what did the interior of the ship look like after so many years of being left adrift and exposed to the harsh conditions of the Arctic? And also, what was it like being on the ship for those 10 days? I mean, imagine being trapped on an abandoned ghost ship in the middle of the Arctic with nothing but darkness, the howling wind, and the groans of the ship as it's constantly compressed by the shifting of the pack ice. To me, that's just so interesting, but terrifying at the same time. Anyway, the next sighting of the Baychimo was in the summer of 1933, when a small schooner called the Trader boarded the ship, and the crew of the Trader reported that around the same time, they spotted a group of natives gathering supplies from the abandoned ship, taking things like mattresses, chairs, and a bucket of sweet pickles, of course, along with several other small amenities. However, during the night, the Baychimo would again disappear, but not for very long, since she was spotted 3 years later, in 1935, just off the northwest coast of Alaska. Then it was spotted again in 1939, where she was boarded another time by Captain Hugh Polson, who actually attempted to salvage the ship and bring it back to port. But unfortunately, his ship was just too small, and he really didn't have enough crew members to safely bring it back into port, so the Baychimo was once again abandoned. This would actually be the last recorded boarding of the Baychimo. And later in 1939, she was spotted several times, but each time a boarding attempt was made, it failed, almost as if the Baychimo itself didn't want anyone else to board her. No, I'm just kidding. Sightings of the Baychimo slowed considerably during World War II, and for many years after that. So it was pretty much widely assumed that the Baychimo had finally just had enough and sank, but to everyone's surprise, she was spotted again in March of 1962 by a group of natives who saw the big steamer drifting quietly along in the Beaufort Sea, still intact and afloat. Then again, in 1969, 38 years after it was first abandoned, the Baychimo was spotted again, this time trapped in pack ice in the Chukchi Sea, off the northwest coast of Alaska between areas known as Icy Cape and Barrow Point, not too far from where it was first abandoned in 1931. Then after that, nothing. This would be the last time that anyone would report seeing the ship. And since 1969, there have been no official sightings of the SS Baychimo. Even though there have been no official sightings of the SS Baychimo for nearly 53 years, that hasn't stopped people from believing that it may still be out there. In fact, in 2006, the Alaskan government started a project to locate the roughly 4,000 ships that have been lost along the coast of Alaska, including the SS Baychimo. But so far, no wreckage or signs of the Baychimo have ever been found. And personally, it seems pretty unlikely that the ship is still afloat, because for its first 40 years of being left adrift, it was spotted well over a dozen times. But now it's been over 50 years and there still hasn't been a single official sighting. But I mean, who's to say for sure? Until we actually see the wreckage or any sign of where it might be, there may still be a small chance that the Baychimo is still drifting through the quiet, frigid waters of the Arctic. The Swedish. Sometimes they build ships that last for less than a day, like the Vasa, and sometimes they build ships that survive abandoned for decades. Anyway, that's it for today. If you enjoyed hearing about the SS Baychimo, feel free to stick around. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.